Hello retro gamers and welcome to yet another repair video. Yes, 2 in a row. Today I have this Atari 2600 Junior, which I've actually had for a very long time. I bought this back in 2011 for $11, would you believe it? I've been on a bit of a kick recently buying broken junk on eBay, so I figured I had better make my way through the backlog before I get onto anything else. Okay, just so we're all on the same page, this was my initial setup for testing the console. Here you can see a working Atari 2600 Junior, and in that I have the game Kangaroo. This is plugged into a VCR, or tuned into a VCR I should specify, which then plugs into a monitor on my table. This is then also plugged into a portable speaker for the sound since the monitor doesn't have any. The reason I'm showing you this is that so we can be sure that there's nothing external that's causing the problem. So we know that the power supply, the video leads, the game, etc, all that is fine because that works with this working console here. So with that, we can focus on the actual broken console itself. So what does happen when I turn this Atari 2600 on? Well, the good news is that it does actually turn on, but it doesn't output a stable video. In fact, it doesn't really output any good video at all. We get a bit of a black flashing screen here, and if we're lucky enough, we'll get some colored flashing static. Wiggling the cartridge around doesn't really do anything. It might make the flashing colorful static a bit more flashy, but otherwise, there's a video problem here. So without further ado, let's get this thing apart. Deconstruction is very simple and straightforward. There are simply 6 Phillip head screws to be pulled out. Once the screws are gone and you separate the two halves, be mindful of a ribbon cable that connects the two halves together. This is for the buttons on the top so they can connect into the motherboard. After the main board is removed, you'll need to remove the RF shielding as well, which you can see is quite rusty and crusty here. Usually this shield connects in through the main board and the metal is twisted so it holds in place. I must have untwisted this originally when I pulled it apart back in 2011, so you don't see it here. But if it is an unopened 2600, that is something you'll have to do. And as we can see, the board doesn't actually look too bad. I must have had the foresight to clean it back in 2011. It's probably all I knew how to do in regards to electronics back then. But we shall clean it anyway, because you'll be surprised how many problems can be fixed by some simple cleaning. Now, there was a bit of corrosion on the board, so I figured I would start with the white vinegar. White vinegar is very good at eating up corrosion, especially from batteries or the electrolytic fluid that comes out of capacitors when they inevitably pop. And I just simply gave this a good scrub over with a soft tipped toothbrush, and I did both sides. And as you can see on the paper towels below, quite a bit of muck was coming off.
Oh man, look at that. That is gross.
Lastly, for good measure, I gave the cartridge slot a good scrub because this felt like an obvious point of error at the time. After that, I simply washed the motherboard with water. I probably should have used distilled water in hindsight, but this is what I did. I didn't really want the board smelling like white vinegar any longer, and honestly, I'm not too sure of the effects if it stays on the board for a prolonged period. With the board cleansed using the powerful nature of vinegar, I gave the board a good looking over and 2 components stood out to me. This resistor and this capacitor. The legs on both were quite corroded. Not sure if the corrosion were coming from the components themselves or from an external source, but regardless, we'll return to these later. After that, as a quick test, I thought I'd better check to make sure that the board was getting the appropriate voltage from the power supply. I wasn't too worried about this because I know the power supply works in the other Atari, but regardless, I still had to check it, and I got 8.8 volts out of a 9 volt power supply, which isn't too shabby, I guess. After that, I got busy with the isopropyl alcohol, and I did very much the same thing that I did with the white vinegar. I gave it a good scrub on both sides, and the cartridge slot was still a point of interest for me at this point, so I got a card and covered in isopropyl alcohol and gave it a good jamming in there to try and get a deep clean on all of the pins. I also gave it a scrub for good luck. And then I got busy reflowing a bunch of solder points on the bottom of the board. A lot of these were looking pretty dull, which isn't too surprising since this was probably manufactured sometime between the mid and late 80s. The date code on there says 1983, but I believe that was designed then and they didn't actually sell these until much later. But anyway, this isn't a history video. I paid particular attention to those that were there for the ICs. The bottom chip is called a tier chip, and that's what generates the video and audio. And that is sadly a custom made component for the Atari. You can buy more of them, but stocks of them are dwindling as the days go on. We won't be able to buy them forever. So after all that, it was time for another test, and no, still nothing, still the same. So with that, I started trolling the internet and forums trying to find general problems with these things, and the voltage regulator was an issue that came up time after time. So I tested the regulator, and while I got over 9 volts on one, I was getting 4.93 volts on another when it was, supposed to be 5. I later learned that this is still within tolerance and is likely just a side effect of age. It shouldn't actually affect the working of the console. But since it was such a common part, you can still go down to any electronics store and buy the exact same voltage regulator, I figured it couldn't hurt to replace it. The VREG itself is held onto the board with a screw and a nut through the heatsink, so this will need to be removed before we can actually desolder it. So after applying some flux and some brand new solder to help the points flow a little better, I got to work with my new toy. Yes, this is a vacuum electric desolder pump or something along those lines. You can get very expensive versions of these, which you see a lot of YouTubers using. I, on the other hand, paid $30 for this from China, so it's probably a bit more dodgy as far as the electrical workings of it goes, and it's probably not as effective as those more expensive ones, but to me, it made a world of a difference when it came to desoldering things. These through-hole components would probably take a couple of minutes each, but with this dodgy little gun, I can do it in about 20 seconds. It's really helped me a lot. So with that, out of the old, in with the new, I soldered in the new VREG and screwed it into place. And while I was reading much stronger voltages, especially on the 5 volt rail, plugging it in for a test, and I was greeted with more disappointment. This did not fix the issue. So, moving on. So after that, I briefly turned my attention to the 3 ICs. I didn't really know what I was doing at this point in the repair in regard to them, so I simply just tested that the right amount of voltage was going to all 3, which it was. I also checked that they were grounded properly, and they were. So I turned my attention back to that resistor and that capacitor that I saw from before that had the corroded legs. I first pulled out the resistor, very much using the same process as the voltage regulator, using my new favorite toy, and reading its value once it was out of circuit, I got this. Ooh. It's supposed to be 9.1. Now, I'm not sure if that's intolerance or not, but it did seem wrong at the time, so I replaced it. I then replaced the capacitor, and while I don't have the exact same form factor as whatever they put on the board sometime during the 80s, I did find an equivalent. It's still very easy to buy in the shops today. Here's a nice little time lapse of me replacing it, because there's not really enough for me to say over that entire period. With that, we have new components installed. The resistor looks a bit on the piss, and the capacitor definitely looks out of place, but I checked continuity and all that jazz and everything seemed to be fine. Now, I don't have it on video, but of course I did go and test it with the monitor again, and no, I didn't get anything. So I continued my troubleshooting efforts. Although I should add that they probably should have been replaced anyway, since they were corroded and in the process of corroding. but it's sad that it didn't fix it. That would have been such a good fix if they did. So I have a few other troubleshooting things here that I read on the internet with other people who have the same problem. A lot of people were referring to the power switch as being an issue, and I could see below that it was pretty dirty in there, so I removed it and cleaned under there and put it back on, but alas, that did nothing. I also read that you could fine tune the RF output by spinning this thing, the name of it of which escapes me at this very moment. It did give me some nice variation of the static I was getting before, but this time with some calming blues. But no matter how much I quote unquote tuned it, I wasn't able to get that hopping kangaroo across the screen. But now I was thinking about the RF output. Considering it powers on and I do get a video signal, the RF output was directly in my scopes as the possible cause of the problem. Now, I don't really know anything about RF and I don't really want to use it anyway in this day and age, so you can install a composite mod and this completely bypasses the RF circuit. Now, I didn't design this mod myself. I found it online and I will link that into the description box if you want to do it yourself. It is a very simple mod. It just uses a handful of resistors and a capacitor, and that all just wires into an RCA socket. I also added another socket for audio, but alas, it didn't fix the issue. However, it was just outputting the same video through Composite, so it shows that RF wasn't the problem. And I did have plans to Composite mod this at the end anyway, so now I've really just done that now, so that's good, I guess. It didn't fix the problem, but there's just one less thing I'll have to do later. I'll also add that it does look a bit crappy here, but I will tidy this up once the console is working. Okay, so I had pretty much removed most things on the board from the equation, except for those three ICs, especially the tier chip. That is really the one I'm focusing on the most. So I can only do so much of a multimeter, which you saw before, which was basically just testing that it was receiving the right voltage, and I checked all the continuity to the traces going to and from it to see if I could find any shorts. So it was time to bring out the big guns. And by a big gun, I mean a logic probe. This is a very simple and cheap device. I bought this from JCar. You can also buy it from electronics in kit form. I think it cost me something like $16. What this does is read the digital outputs of the chips. So a chip will either be outputting high or low or both from the pins, and this is indicative of the signal that it's sending. So this has 3 LEDs on it. I'm not really sure what the yellow one does, to be honest, but red means that the chip is outputting high and green means that that particular pin is outputting low. Now, since I didn't really know what I was doing, since this is a new device for me, what I did was laboriously check every single pin on all 3 chips, and I wrote down if they were high or low. So then what I did was pull apart the other working Atari 2600 Junior, and I did exactly the same thing. But this time, I compared the results to the previous console. And what I found is that something is definitely wrong with the outputs on these chips. Probably about half the outputs are the same between the two consoles, but overwhelmingly, all the analog pins are the problem. There's nothing coming from those at all. Now, I'm not sure if that's because the logic probe can't read analog pins. I'm not really sure, as there's probably someone out there screaming at their monitor right now who knows a lot more about this thing than I do, but let me assure you, this is a work in progress. So I started to look at what other things I could fix on the board before I did the inevitable and ordered in a new tier. So I did what I've done on plenty of other consoles in the past. I replaced all of the electrolytic capacitors. Electrolytic capacitors, even if they're not bad now, will be bad one day soon. Eventually, they will pop or burn out in some way, and the electrolytic fluid will spew out and cause more problems. Luckily, I had all of the replacement capacitors on hand and in stock, so I sort of did this on a whim. The 4 little guys across the board were easy enough to replace, but I did have to get a bit more creative with this big guy here. This is called an axial capacitor, and as you can see, the legs jut out from both sides, as opposed to the bottom like with the other capacitors. These are a bit harder to find these days. You can order them online, but you can't just walk into any of my local friendly electronic stores and buy one. But since it is just an electrolytic capacitor, just in a weird form factor, I managed to find this capacitor, which I scavenged from something a long time ago, that had the exact same specs. What I ended up doing was snipping out the main capacitor bit and keeping the legs there, and then I bent the legs on the capacitor in a way that they could sort of sit in the same sort of orientation, and then I used a separate leg from another capacitor which I snipped to act as the extension cord basically, so it would all fit into one place in a very similar sort of form factor. Now this does look pretty bodgy, I'm not gonna lie, but it does work. I do have continuity and it does seem to be working as anticipated. However, the exact same problem still persists. Yes, this console isn't fixed yet, which is why it is part 1. At this point, I already had over 2 hours of footage of me fixing this thing, and I really didn't want it to be this huge long video when I finally did get it out. So I thought I'd release it in these easier to consume bite-sized episodes, which will probably only go for 15 minutes or so. Oh geez, I don't even know. But regardless, I don't really regret replacing those capacitors because, as I said, if they weren't going to pop today, they were probably going to pop tomorrow. So, what's next for this Atari 2600 Junior? Well, let me show you what I did. Yes, I bought a TIA. TIA stands for Television Interface Adapter. And since I sure am having a hard time getting this to interface with a television of any kind, it does seem like the next logical step in this repair. Now these aren't cheap these days, as I said they are running low on stock. Atari only ever made so many of them, and not another one will ever be made again. But I am lucky being in a PAL region, the PAL chips are certainly more common than the NTSC ones, which are common over in America. So, what else can you expect in the next video, which will be out God knows when. I promise this will only be a 2-parter, I won't release any more than that. Regardless, I will be installing the new TIA chip, as you can imagine, and I will be socketing this, which is good practice for this sort of thing, I think. And then I'll do whatever other troubleshooting is required if that doesn't fix anything, although I will be a very sad man if it doesn't. Other than that, I will be tidying up the Composite Mod and installing it properly into the case, much like I did with that Master System 2 a couple of years ago, if you're not sure what I'm going on about there. And then lastly, I will be dealing with the rust on the RF shield, because I would like to put it in there even though I'm not using RF. It does help, I think, especially with electricity. I don't really know what I'm talking about, but interference in general. So I will be dealing with the rust because that will be going back in. But that's it for this video. Sorry there was no formal conclusion, but I think there is lots of interesting troubleshooting throughout, so I thought I'd better upload it anyway before I get on to the next big step. But regardless, again, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in part 2.